If we take a look at a form, you'll see that there are different areas that the user interacts with, whether that's typing a name, ticking a box, or selecting an option from a drop-down. These are what we call inputs, and there's many different types of them. Along with these inputs, we have text sitting somewhere above it or beside it, saying what those inputs are for the user. This is what we call a label. When we put HTML in the form that we created in the previous video, we add these two elements together, a label element and an input element. Let's start with the label element. The label element just describes the input that will go after it. It needs an attribute to tell the browser which input it is for. This is actually called the for attribute. You can put whatever you want as the parameter for this attribute, as long as you match it with the input, which we'll look at in a minute. The input element is a lot like the image element in that we don't create any content for it. The browser does that for us, so we can make it self-closing. It does, however, need some attributes. One of those attributes is the type attribute. This tells the browser what type of input it is, whether that is a checkbox or, in our case, just text. If I save that, we'll see the label and the input next to each other in the browser on the right. The type attribute only takes a certain set of parameters, and in the next section we'll look at the different things that you can put in the type attribute. Remember the for we had on the label here with our username? We need to match that to the input. We do that by putting an ID attribute on the input which matches the parameter of the for attribute for the label. These two things have to be the same. They can be whatever you want, they just have to be the same. This now means that the browser matches those two things together and they belong to each other. If I click on the label here, the input will be selected. If these two attributes weren't the same, this wouldn't be the case. There's one more attribute that inputs usually have, and that's the name attribute. When you send the data of the form away, whatever the user writes in the text box is sent, but we need to send something to identify what that is. That is what the name attribute is for. Again, it can be whatever you want. Now that we understand the basics for labels and inputs, let's move on and have a look at the different types of inputs that you can have in a form.